Hi everybody and welcome to Heel Heat. My name is George Coles, and on this episode we're doing a top 10. Topic for this top 10, top 10 Mick Foley matches. Now this is what I would consider the 10 best matches of Mick's career, either as himself, Dude Love, Cactus Jack, or Mankind. And being as that Mick Foley is my favorite wrestler of all time, this was a very hard list to narrow down because I love so many of his matches. With that being said, there may be some minor spoilers in here. I'm going to try and not give the results of the matches away. Let's jump right into our list. Starting off with number 10, Mick Foley vs. Randy Orton from Backlash 2004 in a Falls Count Anywhere match. You're going to see as I go down the list, there is a somewhat common theme with a lot of these matches, and that theme is Mick in his various personas helping to elevate a different wrestler and get them to a different level that they previously weren't at. Looking back now, 20 years later, we all look at Randy Orton as one of the all-time greats. At this point, he was just about 2 years into his WWE run, and to be honest, he had a shoulder injury that derailed one of those years, so he wasn't quite as established. He was well on his way to being established, but he wasn't where he'd be now. A lot of what got him there was his Legend Killer gimmick and him going against legends, and this being one of those matches and one of those rivalries that came out of that. Mick Foley was able to bring a more violent, a more sadistic side out of Randy Orton that we still see to this day. When he needs to, he could dial that up. He could dial up the ruthlessness. And this was one of the very first examples of Orton going to that different level, that main event level. It's one of those things that when you have a perfect dance partner, it helps to elevate both guys. Being able to hang with Mick Foley in this kind of environment definitely helped his career. Now going from that, on number 9, Cactus Jack versus Triple H from No Way Out 2000 in a Hell in a Cell match. There are a few guys that are so synonymous with Cactus Jack or Mick Foley's career, Triple H, Sting, The Undertaker, The Rock, that you have to basically have some of their matches on here. In my opinion, pound for pound, the rivalry between Triple H and Cactus Jack, or Mick Foley and his different personas, was one of the better rivalries during both men's career. Much like I said with Randy Orton, when they began their rivalry, Triple H wasn't quite at the level that he would get to being another one of the all-time greats. With the help of matches with Mankind, then Dude Love, and then Cactus Jack, also with the help of being attached to D-Generation X, he would eventually climb and become one of the greats. And this was well on his way to that. He was already an established main eventer. Their rivalry at this point had gone on for a few years, and this was a really fun match. This is in that last run of Mick's full-time wrestling schedule. He would go on after this year to be less and less. He'd have sporadic appearances, and I know he did have a more full-time run in TNA a couple years later, but with the way they taped everything, it wasn't as hectic as it was at this time in the WWE. Just another great match, one of their great matches and a great rivalry. I really enjoy this. I think it gets overlooked by the other Hell in a Cell match and other matches these guys have had together, but I do think it's a really enjoyable match and one that you should probably look for and watch. Going from that, our number 8, Mick Foley versus Edge from WrestleMania 22 at a hardcore match. Mick Foley himself has mentioned that until this point he didn't really feel like he had a WrestleMania moment, quote unquote. I tend to disagree because I think the dumpster match was a great moment, him and Terry Funk versus the New Age Outlaws. I think that was a very memorable match. Unfortunately, it's on a card that basically starts off Steve Austin's run as world champion, so I kind of get where he's coming from, and you don't really see that on the highlight. You see parts of this on the WrestleMania build-up highlight packages, especially the part where Edge spears him through the flaming table. Much like I said with Orton and Triple H, Edge ramped up his violence for this. Mick Foley seemed to bring that part out of everybody, and he was great at doing so. Edge, another all-time great. I mean, you go up and down the list of his opponents, Mick Foley that is, and it's a who's who in wrestling for the the 20 years that he was involved. This is just a great match. I highly recommend this one as well. Matter of fact, I recommend everything on this list, so I should probably just stop saying that. Going from that, our number 7, Cactus Jack versus Big Van Vader from Halloween Havoc 1993 in a Texas death match. When I think about the kind of wrestling that I really love, and don't get me wrong, I like all styles. I like technical wrestling, I like high flyers, I like King's Road style, I like strong style, all the different styles. I think there's something fun about comedy wrestling even. But to me, this straightforward, as the great JR would say, slobber knocker type match where it's just two guys beating the crap out of each other, that's always going to draw me in. There's something about that that makes it feel more realistic than all the other matches. And like I said, not saying that I don't enjoy other styles. This would be akin to something like a Sheamus versus Gunther now, or Drew McIntyre versus Gunther, or any combination of those guys. Eddie Kingston's another great example of a current wrestler that has that kind of believability. A lot of people can point to Kingston and say he's much like a new, this generation Mick Foley. This was awesome because there are very few people that could take the onslaught of Vader and come through it on the other side and look better at times. This match was brutal, it was violent, it was everything you would expect. Big Van Vader, another great of all time. I absolutely love this match, hence why I made it here. Next up, our number 6. Dude Love versus Stone Cold Steve Austin from Over the Edge 1998, when it was still an In Your House pay-per-view, with the special referee Vince McMahon. I know, we won't talk about his issues. The Stooges, Pat Patterson and Gerald Briscoe, are on commentary and timekeeping. And we had The Undertaker as pretty much Austin's safety valve, I guess you could say, or his equalizer to make sure there's not as much shenanigans as there could be. When I started putting together this list, I didn't know how many Dude Love matches would be considered for this. I honestly didn't think there would be any. And then when I started really thinking about the great matches of Mick's career, this one was one that stood out right away. And we often forget that this was a heel Dude Love, because he's kind of overshadowed by what the Mankind character would be as both part of the corporation and then turning face a bit later, and all of the greatness he did there. This was a really awesome match. This was Austin's real first opponent after winning the championship. This was him proving he could continue on with that title. I don't remember if he defended the title on Raw before this, after winning this, or if this was his first actual championship defense, but it's the first really memorable one. When I look back and I look at that Attitude Era and the people that made it special, it's Austin, it's The Rock, it's Triple H, it's Mick Foley, it's The Undertaker, Kane, and yes, Vincent Kennedy McMahon. That whole mix of these people made that era in wrestling so memorable and so special to people that went through it. It's why it's so revered now. Even though some of it was absolutely terrible and unwatchable, the characters and the wrestlers that were in them characters made it something that you had to watch every week. I won't say that every week was pure gold. There were a lot of times that it was absolute garbage. There's a lot of things that rose-colored glasses has us forget about the era, but matches like this are clear examples of why it is thought of so fondly. I absolutely love this. Probably my favorite Dude Love match of all time. That's why it's on my list here. I'll go from that on number 5. Cactus Jack versus Sabu from ECW Holiday Hell 1995. With the smart wrestling fans of the time, there were two wrestlers that embodied the hardcore style in North America more than anybody else, and that was Sabu and Cactus Jack. Cactus Jack did it on a more national level with what he was doing in WCW. Sabu was kind of the underground guy, the guy that was doing it on ECW and in different independent companies, also working with FMW. Whenever these two would match up, it was almost like a dream match. You had the two wrestlers that embodied what Sabu's gimmick said he was. They were both homicidal, suicidal, and genocidal. They didn't care who they injured. If they injured themselves, if they injured their opponent, they were pushing the limits of what pro wrestling could be on a violent scale. There are so many wrestlers that have drawn influence from these two guys, whether it be all of the hardcore wrestlers in CZW, XPW, all the different promotions that have come up in the time frame, even GCW now, or the high flyers that took a lot of influence from Sabu. I think Sabu is one of the most influential wrestlers that not a lot of people realize how influential he is, because a lot of the stuff that people took from him, you don't even realize they took it from him because he was doing it in front of 1,000 people. And for everybody that says that they love ECW and ECW was great, as an ECW fan, all of those people could not have been watching the show, because if they were, it would not have went out of business. And that's just the facts of it. ECW was definitely the third promotion. Whether it was your favorite promotion or not, it was the third. And not as many people seen it as WCW or WWF at the time. And you would see stuff that Sabu would innovate coming on those other shows. I've said this many a times, and this isn't a knock on the guys, the Hardy Boys took a lot of inspiration from both Sabu and Rob Van Dam. If you watch Sabu and Van Dam tag matches, and you watch Hardy Boys matches, especially during this time, you could see where the inspiration came from. This was just another one of those legendary matchups of these two guys. Like I said, anytime they got together, it was a great match. And there's another one I want to mention that didn't make this list at all, but it's a great match, and it's even less known than this, and that is when Mick Foley as Mankind wrestled Sabu at Terry Funk's WrestleFest, which was loosely an ECW show, mostly self-promoted by Terry Funk as his last match in Amarillo, Texas. It had members of WWF's roster in the show. It had members of ECW's roster on the show. Funk wrestled Bret Hart in the main event. On the undercard, Mick Foley as Mankind wrestled Sabu, which I believe is the only time that Mankind and Sabu wrestled each other, which is another really fun match. I don't know if it's on the internet. I have it on DVD somewhere. I had the VHS back in the day when it was fresh. But another great match. It didn't make the list, but another example of these two guys coming together and having a great match together. And off from that, our number 4, Cactus Jack versus Sting from Beach Blast 92, the Falls Count Anywhere match. You notice there is a pattern here. The Falls Count Anywhere, the hardcore, Texas death matches, all kind of in a similar vein. Much like I said with Orton, Triple H, Edge, this brought out a different side of Sting. Between the matches he had with Cactus Jack and Big Van Vader, it showed his toughness. It showed that he was more than just a great technical wrestler with a great look and face paint. It showed that he was more than just a high-flying fan favorite. He was a guy that could stand toe-to-toe with the toughest wrestlers in the world and come out on the top. Mick in his first book said that for a long time this was his favorite match. And you can obviously see why. This is a very good match. This era of WCW, I really enjoyed. This was pre-NWO, pre-Dungeon of Doom. This is where you had the building blocks of what would be successful for the next decade was all bubbling up in WCW. Guys like Sting, Cactus Jack, Vader, Hall and Nash were there. Scott Hall is the Diamond Stud. Nash is Vinny Vegas, and different timelines, not, all through this era. Steve Austin was there as Stunning Steve Austin. Brian Pillman was there. Dustin Rhodes. A lot of the wrestlers that would go on to define that decade were in WCW at this time and really making a name for themselves. I really love this match. I'm a big, huge fan of both these guys. I'm going to be very sad in a couple weeks from now when Sting retires and we no longer get to see Sting wrestle. And yeah, I'm the first person that'll say someone hung on too long, but I'm also the first person that'll want to watch that person that's hung on too long. I paid for Ric Flair's last match, if that makes what I'm saying makes sense. This is another great rivalry in Cactus's, aka Mick's career. I absolutely loved it. Well, from that, our number 3, Mankind versus Shawn Michaels at In Your House Mind Games 1996. This was kind of a precursor of where the WWE or WWF at the time was going to go in the next few years. This was prior to the Attitude Era. This was right around the time of King of the Ring and Stone Cold becoming Stone Cold. This is before DX. This is before the Hart Foundation and Bret Hart turning heel. This was an interesting time in WWF's history. as it kind of was a down period in a lot of ways, and they kind of fell behind WCW as far as popularity with wrestling fans. But if you go back and you watch, you start to see some of the building blocks come in here. You start to see matches like this, where they're pushing the envelope of what WWF would do. They're bringing a more violent style. They're bringing more high-flying style on Shawn Michaels' end. And they're giving us matches that we hadn't seen the quality of before in WWF. One of the big knocks at the time of WWF was WCW is where you'd watch the great matches. WWF is where you would watch the great storylines. And they started improving their match quality around this time, and they started catching up with WCW, and eventually, with the help of both of these men, they eventually started beating WCW. Just a fantastic match, one that I think gets a lot of hype and is very deservedly so. If you haven't seen it before, I definitely recommend seeking it out, and I know I mentioned I wouldn't say that before, but it's hard not to recommend stuff like this. Definitely go watch this. It's an awesome match. We'll go from that on number 2. Cactus Jack versus Triple H from Royal Rumble 2000 in a street fight. I mentioned the No Way Out Hell in a Cell match, which was part of this feud. Mick Foley as Cactus Jack and as his own character himself had an ongoing feud towards the end of his run here against Triple H. And this match is just fantastic. This again was these two guys going out there and just beating the crap out of each other. There was thumbtacks, there was barbed wire, there was fire, there's everything you would expect in a match of that era, in the craziness of it, the pure brutality. Just another really fun match. Like I said, Triple H and Cactus Jack, they go together so well. This match was probably my favorite of all their matches. I do recommend another one that didn't make this list at all, much like I said with the Sabu match. The match, it's from Monday Night Raw. I don't know the exact date, but it's scheduled to be Dude Love versus Triple H in a Falls Count Anywhere match again. But this is the infamous match where Dude Love sits down and he says he doesn't think that the Dude can bring it in this kind of match, so he has somebody that he thinks he could do it. And then he brings in Mankind, and Mankind says, you know, dude, I'd love to do it, and as much as both of us would like to hurt Hunter Hearst Helmsley, I don't think either one of us is the guy for it, but I do have a guy in mind. And they go through a whole hilarious back and forth with each other, and they bring out the WWE debut of Cactus Jack. That's one of my favorite moments in Monday Night Raw history. The match itself is good. I really like it. It's not as good as this match. A lot of what I really liked about it is the setup and the reactions of Triple H, who sold this like $1 million. If he didn't react to the announcement of Cactus Jack the way he did, I don't think it would have got over as much as it did. This was one of those times that was a nod to the fans, to people like myself that grew up watching Cactus Jack and thinking that Cactus Jack is the best of the three faces of Foley. We finally got to see him in the WWF. Just a fun match. As well as the match we're actually talking about, Royal Rumble 2000 Street Fight, which I think is a better match itself, but both are awesome. Now, before I get to my number 1, I do a thing here on my top 10s called the best of the rest. Basically, it is things that are thought of for the list but didn't quite make it. First up, Cactus Jack and Kevin Sullivan versus the Nasty Boys from WCW Slamboree 1994 in a Broad Street fight. This was awesome. There's a lot of things that went into this and made it awesome. First off, it's in Philadelphia, and they bring out as a special referee Dave the Hammer Schultz, who's a Philadelphia Flyer great. I'm a huge Philadelphia Flyers fan. I grew up just outside of Philadelphia, hence why I've seen so much of ECW. I grew up watching the Flyers and loving the Flyers, and Dave the Hammer Schultz was on the Broad Street Bullies team, the team that basically put the Flyers organization on the map. And there was a time, I don't know if he still holds the record, but he was the most penalized hockey player in the history of hockey for a time. I don't know if he still has that record or not. And you were just as soon to see the Hammer have a fight with somebody as you would to see him get a goal or an assist. And that's not to say that he wasn't a great player otherwise. He just set that bar, that expectations of what the Flyers and Flyers hockey could be, much like Cactus Jack did in wrestling. And with this match, you had Cactus and Kevin Sullivan, who was kind of a forebearer to Cactus, going up against the Nasty Boys, who are one of the great brawling tag teams of all time. The Nasty Boys don't get brought up on lists of the top 10 tag teams of all time or top tag teams of all time, but they really should be thought of that way. They may not have had as big of an impact as the Road Warriors or be as technically sound as someone like the Steiner Brothers or the Midnight Express, but their style and their brawling was a precursor to a lot of what we've seen. You could directly correlate the Nasty Boys to teams like the Public Enemy and the Dudley Boys later on. And even you could go down the road and say they were a lot like the APA. The APA drew a lot of inspiration from teams like the Nasty Boys or Ron Simmons' previous team, Doom. It's a really fun match. It was thought of for the list, but unfortunately it didn't quite make it. Last but not least on the best of the rest, Cactus Jack and Raven versus Tommy Dreamer and Terry Funk from the November to Remember 1995. I made a video just a little bit ago about the rivalry between Raven and Tommy Dreamer in ECW, and it being one of my favorite rivalries of all time. Part of that was how they incorporated people like Cactus Jack, who had joined the side of Raven and became basically Raven's second in command, and the promos they would do together. Tommy Dreamer bringing in his idol, Terry Funk, for this match. This was just a great example of what ECW was, what it could be, why it was so beloved for the people that did actually see it. Just a really fun match, hence why it was considered. Unfortunately, didn't quite make the list. Now, before I get to number one, if you think I put a match too high, put something too low, left a match off the list altogether, let me know down here in the comments. While you're there, smash that like button, share the video, subscribe if you haven't. And if you see where it says join, that's how you become a channel member. Becoming a channel member definitely helps me out. Being a smaller YouTuber, that's the kind of thing that helps pay for some of the stuff I have here, like the microphone and camera and lights and all that. And side note, if you may or may not have seen my community page, this is the second time I'm recording this video because I had issues with my microphone yesterday. So yes, becoming a member would definitely help out with stuff like that. With all that being said, our number one Mick Foley match of all time, you had to know it was coming. Mankind versus The Undertaker from King of the Ring 1998, the Hell in the Cell match. You could count on one hand the matches that are as important to the WWF's history as this match is. Hogan vs. Andre, Savage Steamboat, Shawn Michaels Razor Ramon, Bruno versus Buddy Rogers, Austin vs. Michaels. This is right up there with all those matches. Much like other people I mentioned, Sting, Triple H, Big Van Vader, one of Mick Foley's biggest rivalries is The Undertaker. And I would say, much like a lot of the other people I mentioned, he pushed The Undertaker into a different realm than he was before. My friend Gary and I, who you may remember from the early days of this show, often talk about the changes in The Undertaker that happened once he started feuding with Mick Foley. He became more serious. It wasn't so much of a attraction, and he became more of a serious wrestler that could actually hang with some of the best wrestlers in the company at the time, whether that be Austin, Kane, Michaels, Bret Hart. He was able to do that, and a lot of that started with his rivalry with Mick Foley. When these two guys came together, they always made something special, whether it be the Boiler Room match or this match or the Buried Alive match or any of the other number of matches they had against each other. This obviously may not be as good of a match from bell to bell as some of the rest on this list, but for the two big moments here, the moment where Mick gets thrown off the side of the cage and through the announce table, and Jim Ross with probably the best call in the history of wrestling, and yes, I'm going to break out my bad Jim Ross impersonation here. By God Almighty, he's broken in half! Having Mick go through that, the match somewhat be stopped and then restarted, only for him to get chokeslammed through the top of the cage, and from what Mick and everybody else says, that's the more damaging of the two spots. You get the smile with the tooth hanging out of his nose. There are so many iconic moments from this match that anytime there's a highlight reel, even if it's only a 30-second highlight reel of the history of the WWE, parts of that match are in there. That's how important this match is to the history of WWE. This is one of the great spectacles of all time, one of the great car crash matches of all time. I absolutely love this match. It's one of my favorite matches of all time. It is a little bit jarring to watch knowing how badly Mick gets injured during the match, but still, it's one that I think every wrestling fan should watch, and probably most of you have already watched. One of the great matches of all time, in my opinion, and in my opinion, Mick Foley's best. Like I said before, if you made it here to the end, let me know what you think. Let me know what your favorite Mick Foley match of all time is. Do you think it's one that's on my list? Do you have something different? Let me know down in the comments. I'd love to hear your opinion on it. With all that being said, my name is George Coles, and this has been another Heel Heat Top 10.